Hi everyone! Thank you for volunteering to help with the Blue Ridge Parkway Pollinator Project, which is being coordinated through a partnership between the National Park Service and Appalachian State University, with funding provided by Appalachian State and the Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation. My name is Jenny Geib, and I'm going to introduce you to the project and also provide some instructions here for part one, which is setting up the survey. The Blue Ridge Parkway spans almost 500 miles across 2 states, from western North Carolina, just outside the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, to the start of Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. The goal of this project is to inventory pollinators at 60 sites along the entire length of the parkway. Most people visit the parkway for the beauty of the landscape and the stunning vistas. But obviously, there are also some more subtle inhabitants occupying these spaces. Listen carefully on a sunny summer day and you will hear the living landscape. Telltale buzzes indicate some important interactions between the local fauna and flora, and this is what we are here for. The primary objective of the project is to quantify abundance and diversity of local pollinators, primarily bees. What bees might you see out on the parkway? Most people are probably familiar with the cow of the insect world, the domesticated European honeybee, Apis mellifera. We'll probably see many of these in the area, along with some other familiar native species, bumblebees. There are about 10 species of bumblebees native to North Carolina and Virginia that have been actually documented along the parkway from our 2015 preliminary survey of bumblebees. Like honeybees, bumblebees are somewhat social and live in groups called colonies, but their colonies are much smaller, usually around 100 bees total. Colonies consist of a queen and her female workers for most of the summer. At the end of the summer, the colony will switch to producing new female queens and male drones, which head out to find partners for mating. Only the new queens overwinter underground, ready to emerge in spring and start the process over again. Much less familiar to many people are the many species of bees that do not participate in group living, the native solitary bees. Despite flying under the radar for most humans, they make up a great proportion of bee diversity, possibly close to 100 species that we could find in our inventory. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the methods that we'll be using in our pollinator inventory. The first thing that's really important to know is how we will be sampling. So unlike other organisms such as salamanders and birds, where the organisms are large enough to see the most important characteristics and the species lists are really less than 100 names long, with insects, including pollinators, we must lethally sample and return to the lab in order to identify our specimens. There could be hundreds of different species of bees alone along the parkway. Many times we must use special microscopes to see very small characteristics for identification. And here you can see Eric, who is working to identify some of his pin specimens from 2015. We will be using 2 collection methods to sample bees along the parkway. The first most important method that we'll be using are propylene glycol traps, which are basically cup traps that are filled with a propylene glycol and water mixture. The other method that we'll be using are netting foragers on blooming patches along the parkway. This part of the survey will be optional for our volunteers, and we'll talk more about that a little later. So let's get into the nitty-gritty with the propylene glycol traps. So first of all, let's look to see what you should have received in your kit. Your kit is the big blue tote bag that you should have received from either Paul Super from the Park Service or myself. So you should have, first of all, 9 glycol trap stands that are made of PVC. You should have 9 12-ounce plastic cups, 3 each of the yellow, blue, and white varieties. These are the cups that will fit into your trap stands. You should also have 9 extra 12-ounce plastic cups, and we'll talk later about why you'll have extras. You should have a gallon of propylene glycol that has been mixed with water and tinted blue. And this will be poured into your cup traps for collecting the pollinators. Then you should have some supplies that will mostly be used for later when we're actually going back to check the traps and collecting the samples. So here you should have a container of ethanol that's used for bee preservation. You should have a brine shrimp net that's used to retrieve the insects out of the cups. You should have a bag of whirl packs, which are the little plastic bags with twist ties attached to them. You should also have a batch of 11 1-gallon size plastic bags. And you should have a couple of mechanical pencils. There should be 2 sheet protectors that contain, one of which contains your labels and the other of which contains a copy of our research permit. So the 3 things that you're going to need to actually establish your transect of traps for our pollinator survey are these 3 things, which I've highlighted in yellow. And that's the glycol trap stands, your set of plastic cups that have been painted yellow and blue or left white, and your gallon of propylene glycol that's been tinted blue. Make sure that you don't confuse the propylene glycol with the container of ethanol. The ethanol is clear in color. There are a few additional materials that we have not supplied, but that we suggest you bring along if possible. The first is a plastic tub or deep tray to hold the jugs of liquid. That ethanol that we've given you, it will evaporate if it spills, but the propylene glycol, if it gets onto your upholstery, it will just make a sticky mess. So it's really best to keep it all contained in some kind of a tray. If you have a reflective vest, we suggest you wear it while working along the Parkway. This will indicate to visitors that you have some official reason for wandering around in the ditches and hammering pieces of plastic into the ground. They will be much less suspicious of you if they see you wearing this vest. If you have a hammer or mallet, that will be really helpful for pounding the traps into the ground. Now, if you happen to forget this, you can just find a big rock somewhere and it will work just as well. But the hammer or mallet comes in very handy. When you're trimming vegetation around the traps to make sure that they are visible to pollinators as the vegetation grows up throughout the summer, it'll be very necessary to keep a pair of scissors in your car and possibly a pair of pruners if your site has a lot of shrubby vegetation. The clipboard is really useful for helping you keep track of your labels and your pencils, especially on a windy day, which happens quite a bit in our area. So, how to find a site that would be good for sampling pollinators. So you should have an assignment of 1 or more mileposts. As near as possible to each milepost that you've been assigned, you should select an area that is a grassy bay or other area that is more than a strip of grass along the road. It is totally fine if that site is slightly sloped upward or downward, or if it's even lower than the roadway. That is totally fine. However, the more open and sunny the area is, the better. Finding a good place to put the traps basically requires balancing visibility to insects with the risk of traps getting mown down or disturbed by visitors. We basically don't want bowls in places where they will get mowed over, stepped upon by livestock, or disturbed by people. The traps should be out of easy view of the road, the trailheads or parking areas and pull-offs. We don't want to bother visitors looking at the scenery, and we don't want to attract folks that might remove the traps for good or bad reasons. So again, select a location that's well away from the road if possible. So here at this particular site, note where the mowing line is. You can see the clear delineation here that I've marked in yellow. And in this site, you can place the traps just behind the mowing line so that it won't get mowed over later, but it's still fairly accessible for you when you need to come back and visit it. And the traps will still be in the sun. So the traps should be placed in a line, which we call a transect, in groups of 3. Each group of 3 should have 1 yellow, 1 blue, and 1 white cup, kind of in a triangle configuration. Note here that we have 3 groups of 3 traps. Now, if you have a site that isn't wide enough to have 3 groups of 3 traps all in a row, it is completely okay if your transect curves rather than goes across straight. The 3 sets of 3 traps should be about 5 meters apart from each other. Now, you don't necessarily have to measure this out exactly. You can actually mark this off using 5 paces rather than a measuring tape, and that is totally fine. Just approximately 5 meters, it would be great. So let's take a look at Chloe, who is setting up some traps that we used last year. Hopefully when you go to set up your traps, they will go into the ground as easily as they are here, but on occasion you may encounter some rocks down below the surface and may have to use just a little bit more force. Try to keep them about the same distance apart as the others if you can. Okay.
You think those are too far apart?
They're okay for now.
It doesn't really matter like which way I put the cups.
Now you can see that Chloe is putting the cups into the traps,
try to stick them down in,
pushing
so
them
just
down just a little bit to make sure they're in there securely. And she's going to fill up each cup about 2/3 to 3/4 full with propylene glycol. These traps have a really nice design where there are some small holes poked in the very top of the cup so that if it rains while your cups are set out, the propylene glycol will actually sit at the bottom of the cup, the water will fill up at the top, and will just run out the holes, leaving your specimens inside the cup so that you can come and collect them. All right, so once you have your transect set up, there's some other things that we need to consider too. So right now, at this time of year, the vegetation at most sites looks something like this. But by midsummer, things will be very different. If there's any vegetation, dead or alive, even here at the beginning, go ahead and trim it down close to the ground using either a pair of scissors if you have just some green herbaceous vegetation like grasses and things like that, or if you have some woody, shrubby things, you might need a pair of pruning shears. And about 1 meter across total is probably enough of an area so that pollinators that have, that nice aerial view can get a good look at your cups that are sitting on the ground. These cups are not just blue and yellow painted and white. The blue and yellow paint is actually fluorescent paint, which has been shown to do a better job of attracting in the pollinators. In addition to trimming the vegetation, there are a few other additional tasks that we're going to ask you to do. We'll provide you with a stake to mark the location of your transect. You just want to insert the stake in the ground near, but not right in the middle of the center group of traps. And the stake will also identify the traps as part of the Parkway Pollinator project if someone happens to come along and see what they think are these weird apparatus on the ground. It's going to be really important that you take good notes about where your traps are exactly located so that we can find them if needed. For example, you might say something like, let's say that your mile marker that you've been assigned is 196. You could say the exact location is 196.7 on the right side of the road when driving north. GPS coordinates would be extremely useful as well if you're able to take those. There are a lot of apps on smartphones that will do latitude and longitude. So let's just go through a checklist here to make sure that we have everything that we need to. First, 9 trap stands with cups set up in a transect of 3 groups of 3, just like Chloe's here. The cups are filled about 3/4 full with propylene glycol, which is the blue liquid that should be in your kit. Third, the vegetation around the cups has been trimmed. The stake is hammered in, identifying the location of the transect. And lastly, you've taken notes of the exact location and the GPS coordinates. If all of those things have been checked off, you are now ready for specimen collections, which will happen very soon. Thank you again for helping us with the project. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, please contact Paul Super from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park or myself from Appalachian State University. Our contact information is below. Thank you.